So yeah, Aka just mentioned that there are a few pointers about the consent management framework, and I'll just walk you guys through all of these things. So initially, for setting up the entire consent management framework, the first and the foremost thing is setting up the notice. One needs to prepare the consent notice and have to go through the thorough requirements of the notice. Now, notice cannot be vaguely written. It cannot be complex. It cannot be incomplete. Notice, the requirements of the notice are very pretty much clear. So as of now, DPDP is not explaining the requirements of the notice in detail, but as part of the best practice and the existing GDPR requirement standards, we would suggest that the notice has to be in simple, clear, plain language firstly. So it's very important that the data principal understands what you're trying to say. If they don't get the point, or they don't understand that why are you collecting, what information are you collecting, it is not going to it is not going to be counted as a valid consent. So notice has to be in very simple plain language. It has to be separate for every different purpose. Now you cannot collect bundled consent for three different purposes at the same time. So the separation of collecting consent for different purposes has to be maintained. The notice has to be given in a transparent manner, and it has to give the details of how are you going to process the data, what is the purpose of collecting the personal data, how are you going to maintain the security, what all additional measures are you going to take, is there a transfer taking place, are you sharing the data with someone, what would be the complete process that the business would require your data with. So these things you need to mention as part of the notice. We also need to mention the process of withdrawing the consent. So as part of the notice, one needs to tell that how can you withdraw the consent if in case you are not if you're not agreeing to the processing of the personal data. You also need to give the complaint handling process, or the way the individual or the data principal can raise their request or the complaints. So we'll have to give our contact details that the grievance officer would be handling your complaints, or in case if you want to withdraw your consent, so how can you do that. So the notice has to be detailed and comprehensive, and this has to be given in different languages. So as part of DPDP, it's written that it has to be displayed in 22 languages as per the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Now this is something very new which was not there earlier, and now the organizations would have to put in place the mechanism that the translation happens, and it's easy for all the data principals that they understand these notices in their local regional language. So apart from English, now the requirement would be displaying the notice in the different languages that are in place.
I wanted to know, what do we mean by itemized notice, and practically how is it possible to display the descriptions of the different personal information that we are gathering of the subjects?
Yeah. So it has to be a detailed notice, as in what kind of personal data are we collecting, what are the categories of personal data, who are going to be the recipients, where are the transfers taking place. So the same example, if the use case scenario, if we consider that about Uber, what Akash was mentioning. So in case if we have a statement being displayed on a website earlier, and then we can layer a link to that to have a detailed consent notice where the data users can maybe visit and have these things they can understand as to how the processing and all the other information is being done around the personal data processing is what I feel. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Moving ahead. Now the consent collection has another scenario wherein the data principal is a minor or a child. So a data principal is under the age of 18 years, would be considered as minor as per the Indian law. And in that case, the consent has to be taken from their parent or any local guardian. Now, this has to be a verifiable mechanism has to be in place for the organizations to ensure that the person who is giving the consent on behalf of that minor for processing the personal data of that minor is the local guardian or the parent of that data principal. And even the another case could be that the personal data is being collected collected for a person who has a disability. So even in that case, we would have to collect consent on behalf of such person who has a disability, and the similar verifiable mechanism has to be put in place so that the organizations can ensure that the person who's consenting on behalf of such person with disability is a legitimate relative or a representative, a legal heir. Something of that sort has to be set up by the organizations to ensure that the on behalf consent mechanism is also being implemented. Now, the other concept is about withdrawal of consent. So, a withdrawal of consent has to be very simple, easy, and this has to be notified and specified in the consent notice itself. So, initially, you have to let the data principals know that in case you do not want us to process your personal information at any particular point, this is the process to withdraw. So the age of withdrawing should be compared, or it should be similar to the way you are collecting the consent. So if the consent collection is through a tool, the similar thing of withdrawal, raising a request for withdrawal should be easy and simple for the data subjects or the data principals specifically for them to withdraw their consent as per the act. So valid consent would be considered only when the withdrawal mechanism is also as simple as collecting the consent. Now, another concept that is new to this act is about consent managers. There is not much clarity, but as of now, the understanding about consent manager is it would be a person who's registered with the Data Protection Board of India, and that person or the consent manager would be a single point of contact between the data principals and the data fiduciary. It would be a bridge between the organization and the customers or the users whose personal data we are collecting. And this consent manager would be then accountable to the data principals. So data principals have the freedom or the ace to choose their own consent manager, and consent managers would then provide consent on behalf of the data principal to the data fiduciaries. Now, this process is very new, and we are relating this to account aggregators under the RBI for the banks that we have. So let's consider, for example, that any data principal is accessing the right of data portability from one data fiduciary to other. So consent manager would come into picture. That consent manager would ace this process of allowing this transfer or portability of data would be easier, and the consent manager would make it simpler for the data principal.